Is that your recollection?
Yes.
And do you recall whether or not you were requested to conduct an autopsy of Mark Phillips on February 26th of 2019?
Yes, I do.
I am showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 49. Tell me what that is, please.
It's a copy of my autopsy report and toxicology results.
Given the length of time since the autopsy, and I'm sure you've conducted many autopsies in the meantime, would referring to your report refresh your recollection on certain details?
Yes, that'd be useful.
And do you believe that is a true and accurate copy of the report you prepared, and any additions, such as the toxicology reports?
Yes.
How did you receive Mr. Phillips' body on the 26th?
It's received in a sealed body bag.
How is it sealed?
Just with a plastic tag that closes the bag that the body's enclosed in.
Now, the body was recovered on February 23rd of 2019. Actually, strike that. I'm going to go back. Is that the typical way you receive a body for examination?
Yes.
Now, there were 3 days between the time that Mr. Phillips' body was collected and when you examined it. Are there any concerns about performing an autopsy 3 days after death, or at least when a body was recovered?
Not in this case, there wasn't.
And why were there no concerns, to your knowledge?
He'd been refrigerated, so the body would maintain in a cold environment, is my understanding. So.
Now, you indicated earlier that as part of your procedure for conducting an autopsy, you do an external examination.
Yes.
And and that includes a collection of general data like height and weight.
Yes.
Do you recall how tall Mr. Phillips was?
He was 178 centimeters.
And for someone who, like me, who's not very good with metric, are you able to estimate what that would be in the imperial system?
It's roughly 5 feet 10 inches, something along those lines.
And what was his body weight?
100.1 kilograms.
And what does that translate to in the imperial system?
About 220 pounds.
And as a result of those measurements, did you calculate a body mass index?
Yes.
What was that?
31.6 kilograms per meter squared.
And so that body mass index, that classifies individuals into, or what does the body mass index do?
With that index, it would be obese.
His body would be termed obese?
Yes, that would be classified.
Were there any other notable observations that you made during the external examination of Mr. Phillips' body?
Yes.
Could you detail those, please?
Yes, so just starting at the top, on his face, he had abrasions, which are scrapes, and so he had scrapes on both, or abrasions on both the right and left side of his face. And then he had some blood that was coming out of his nose or his nostrils. on his torso or his body, I guess chest and abdomen on his left side. He also had an abrasion or a scrape. And then on his extremities on his left upper arm, he had some abrasions. And then on the lower left leg, he also had some abrasions and a contusion or a bruise on the left sort of thigh region and down below the knee as well. And then he also had a scrape on his right knee and a bruise on his right leg just below the level of the knee. So in summary, some abrasions or scrapes and bruises in a few different areas on his body.
Why were those documented in your report of those observations?
Just documenting that evidence that there were some injuries to the body. That's part of our routine practice.
Did they have any significance to you at that time?
I mean, they're injuries, and so I mean that's significant. I would take that to be significant.
And can you, after documenting the condition of the external exam, you indicated the next thing that you would do is open up the chest cavity?
Yes.
And when you did that, what did you observe?
Yes, so we open up the chest and abdomen typically first, and so one of the first things I appreciated was that there was blood in the left side of the chest cavity. So that's called a hemothorax, so it just means blood within that thoracic cavity. So he had a little over a liter of blood there. On the left side, he also had a number of fractures or bones that were broken, specifically his ribs. So he had a number of rib fractures. So he had some in the back of his chest cavity that were broken, and they're what are called compound fractures, where they're broken or sort of sticking out, and so those were associated with injuries of the lung. He also had rib fractures that were on the side and then towards the front of the chest. So a number of rib fractures were present all on the left side with associated bleeding into that chest cavity.
You said there is a little over a liter of blood. Is that significant to you?
Yes.
In what way is it significant?
I mean, it tells you that when the injuries occurred, he was alive, so that there's the heart is pumping, so the blood is being able to come out of those damaged tissues or blood vessels that are there. And obviously it can have effects on the physiology of what's going on with the person functioning just because of the blood loss.
Is 1 liter of blood a lot of blood?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the size of a person, there's roughly around 5 liters normally in a person, so 20%.
Did you note any injuries to major veins or arteries?
Not specifically, so like the vessels of the heart, the aorta, or the other big vessels that are connected to the heart were intact.
Does that give you any idea about a rate of blood loss, or how quickly that blood would have accumulated in the chest?
I mean, if you damage the biggest vessel, the aorta, that blood's going to accumulate very, very quickly. Damage to the lungs and the other soft tissue can be not as fast, but it's hard to say exactly how long it would take for that amount of blood to accumulate.
Besides the fractures to the rib, was there ribs? Were there any other findings that you made in the the chest or the thorax area?
No.
Did Mr. Phillips appear to be in good general health?
Yes, I mean, he had some, a little bit of underlying natural disease, but otherwise, healthy.
There any indication that he had any diseases of the bone or skeleton that would cause his bones to fracture more easily?
No.
After examining the thoracic and area, making those observations of the ribs and the blood that had accumulated, what did you do next?
Well, then we examined the abdominal area, and so there weren't any traumatic injuries of the abdomen.
Did you discover any other traumatic injuries on Mr. Phillips' body?
Yes.
And what were those?
So then when the scalp was reflected, he had a bruise over the side of his head on the left side, the left temporalis. Also had a contusion or bruising of that soft tissue. And then once we removed the skull, there was blood that had accumulated on top of the brain. That's called subdural hemorrhage. And so that's bleeding underneath one of the layers that's on that encompasses and protects the brain.
And is the subdural hemorrhage or subdural hematoma, is that consistent with any is that associated with any other conditions that might affect the brain?
Not exactly sure what you're asking, to be honest.
That's something that's consistent with a concussion?
I mean, so you can have a subdural hemorrhage and have a concussion, but it is possible to get a subdural hemorrhage from trauma and not have a concussion. But particularly in this scenario, the likely cause of the subdural, the cause of the subdural is from trauma, and so that does tell you that there's been some sort of impact to the head, or the head has impacted something, and so it's possible that there could be physiologic effects on the brain that we wouldn't be able to pathologically identify in autopsy.
So in an autopsy, you can't tell whether or not somebody has suffered from a concussion?
No, not typically.
You had mentioned earlier that also there is toxicology that is performed. What were the findings with Mr. Phillips?
So he had a blood ethanol concentration of 149 milligrams per deciliter, and he also had diphenhydramine at 59 nanograms per milliliter.
What is diphenhydramine?
That's like an antihistamine. It's commonly people think of it as Benadryl. Something people would take for allergies, for example. And
was there any toxicology discovered in his urine?
Yes, he had a urine ethanol concentration of 204 micrograms per deciliter.
Can you explain to the jury why there's a difference in the toxicology or in the amounts of ethanol, which is alcohol commonly, in the blood versus the urine?
Yes, the way ethanol or alcohol is distributed in your body is associated with how much water concentration is in that tissue. Ethanol goes throughout your entire body. And so when there's more water, there's a higher concentration of ethanol in that particular fluid or tissue type. So there's more water in your urine than there is in your blood. So you will get higher concentrations of that alcohol in your urine than you do in your blood.
Is it fair to say that the alcohol in the urine is something that's being excreted by the body and is no longer psychoactive?
Yes.
What does psychoactive mean?
It's not affecting, the way it's not affecting you physiologically. So that's we usually, we use the urine to test to see if there's someone who's been exposed to different types of drugs or alcohol, because your body quickly metabolizes it or changes it. So it's a way for us to quickly easily see if someone has consumed something. But what we're really looking for is if it's in your bloodstream, because then it tells you it's having a physiological effect on you. So it's actually affecting the way you might behave, your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc.
So, at the conclusion, did you list a cause of death before you received the toxicology?
I don't remember off the top of my head the exact. I'd have to look. Probably not, but I would have to double check the exact dates.
Okay. Once you concluded your investigation that you described with the notable or the notations that you've made, did you determine a cause of death of Mark Phillips?
Yes.
And what was that cause of death?
Now, multiple blunt force injuries.
What does that mean, blunt force injuries?
So there's a number of different types of injuries that you can have, and one of those is blunt force. And so that's when a relatively flat or blunt object is striking tissue, or the tissue is striking something that's relatively flat. So like your head hits the windshield of a car, or you fall and hit your head on the sidewalk, or your knee or elbow, that's blunt force. That's in contrast to something like sharp force injuries, which is, as the name implies, an instrument, a knife or what have you, cuts through the tissue. And so what that means for us is like a cutting appearance. You can see that the tissue has been incised or cut, whereas blunt, it's really tearing apart the tissue. And so it has a different appearance when we look at it.
And you said it was multiple blunt force injuries. And so were those the injuries to his head?
Yes.
And also to his torso?
Correct.
Now, did you when you're looking at the type of injuries that Mr. Phillips had, how would you describe the nature of the injuries to his chest?
They're blunt force injuries. There's things that are to note is that they're all on one side of the chest, and so they're not on both sides of the chest. So it seems to be isolated to a particular region where some sort of impact or injury occurred. The posterior rib fractures in particular the bones are fractured and puncturing into the lungs, and with the injuries on the side of the chest and the front would fit with something that could be like a compression type of injury, potentially. But that's the caveat that it's not specific for that, but it is something that could be consistent with a crushing type of injury.
So compression or crushing
Yes.
type of injury. And posterior, that was a word you used, that means like rear or behind?
Right. Yes, the back, the ribs on the back towards the spine.
Now, if based on other blunt force trauma cases that you've seen, can you have an opinion about the type of force that would be required to cause that type of injury to a body?
I mean, I think it would be significant force. I mean, I don't have a specific number that I would use. Those type of injuries, I mean, I've other cases that in my training and experience that I've seen it in have been things where people fallen from a significant height, motor vehicle accidents, people have been run over by vehicles. Just talking about those specific fractures in isolation, not the rest of the circumstances of the autopsy findings.
Dr. Reichert, I'm about to show you some photos.
While we're waiting, Judge, these are going to be sensitive in nature.
Dr. Reichert, I've shown you what's been marked as States Exhibits 50 through 60. Can you examine them and describe them generally, please?
Yes, these are photographs that were taken during the autopsy.
Are those all the photographs that were taken during the autopsy?
No.
And are those photos true and accurate depictions of the observations you made of Mr. Phillips' body on February 26th of 2019?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of Exhibits 50 through 60.
Any objection? Stipulation, no objection. Received.
And may I publish to the jury?
Any objection? No, I assume this counsel is going to be using the Elmo.
We were going to be recording.
That's fine.
So the media is aware to not display the screen.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Reichert, I'm showing you what's been admitted as Exhibit 50. Can you tell the jury what is significant on this photograph of Mr. Phillips' head?
Yes, you're looking at the left side of his face, and this is an area of abrasion that I mentioned earlier, sort of scraping the skin.
Are there any other observations that are apparent on this photograph?
No.
Moving on to exhibit number 51. Can you describe for the jury what they're seeing here?
Yes, this is looking at the left side of the decedent's face, and there's some area of abrasion there.
Is that the left side or the right side?
Excuse me, the right side of his face, I apologize. So the right side of his face, and there's some abrasion.
There's some, what I might think of as discoloration. Is that anything that's significant? Purplish color?
Yeah, so this purplish discoloration is called livor mortis, and so what happens is after someone dies, your blood begins to settle down according to gravity, and so as it begins to pool in the body, over time, the body can take on this kind of purplish discoloration. It is called livor mortis.
Then I am going to just warn the jury that the next photos are more graphic. But he needs that warning. So exhibit number 52. Can you explain for the jury what this is showing?
Yes, this is the side of the scalp. So what happened here, just so you're oriented, is that, so this is the scalp that's been reflected or folded forward towards the feet, and then the scalp towards the back has been folded down. So you're looking at the tissue underneath the scalp, right on the surface of the skull. And what this white area here is the skull. So what you're seeing is this blood, or that contusion that I mentioned earlier, into the temporalis muscle, so into the scalp muscle.
So, and you were indicating with your left hand pointing towards your left temple area. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
And a contusion, is that also known as bruising?
Yes.
Now, why does this photograph look so wide? Or, why did there appear to be such a big area that's open there?
Well, I mean, this is the size of the hemorrhage, but what you're seeing here is that there's a layer of tissue that goes over that region, and what I've done is cut through this tissue and pull it back so it's easier to see where that bleeding is, so it's not as obscured by the soft tissue that would otherwise been on over the surface of it.
Moving on to exhibit 53. Can you describe what this is, please?
So this is from the same region, from the left temporal region on the left side of the head. And so this is where you can see this purple discoloration, which is where the contusion and the bleeding has occurred, but it's underneath that tissue. So this is what it looked like before it was, that tissue on the surface was cut into and peeled off of that.
And there's appears to be a slit or a cut there. Is that something that you had made?
Yes, that would have been done in the process of reflecting the scalp and into it to start to appreciate the meaning there.
And exhibit 54. Can you describe this picture, please?
So now what you're doing is you're looking basically down on the top of the decedent's head. So again, the scalp has been reflected forward. This is the skull that's been removed. The scalp and skull have also been removed on the back of the head. And so what you're seeing here is the brain, and this is what's called the dura mater. So this is like a very tough piece of tissue that's over the surface of the brain attached to the undersurface of the skull. And this little bit of blood that you're seeing, this dark purple discoloration, is bleeding underneath that dura mater, that tough tissue. And that's called subdural hemorrhage, subdural blood. Sometimes people call it accumulation of hematoma, but so it's showing you that there's been bleeding on top of the brain.
And I don't recall that we talked about this earlier. How is that type of injury, that subdural hemorrhage, how is that caused?
Most typically it's from traumatic injury, so it's typically like what we call an acceleration deceleration type of injury. So either the head is moving and then it hits a surface, and then the brain continues to move, and it tears these. You can see these little blood vessels that are still attached here. Those are called bridging veins, and so the brain will continue to move within the skull and actually tear those vessels. You can also get this if the brain is accelerated very quickly. mismatch between the head is moving but the brain continues to move, or vice versa. So that results in tearing or lacerating those vessels and at the point accumulating on the surface of the brain.
Is it 55? So exhibit 55, can you describe what this is for the jury?
Yes, and so what's occurred here is that the front of the chest plate has been removed. So these are where the ribs have been cut on both sides. And then the soft tissue of the chest and abdomen has been pulled back, and all the organs from the chest and abdomen have been removed. So you're looking inside to the person's chest cavity, so it's like you're looking through someone to their back, and this is their spine, the spine here. And then on the posterior side here, where this dark discoloration is, there's where the rib fractures were. There's some additional rib fractures that you can see here on the sides. So these are the ribs coming across. The blood is telling us that the bones are broken, and in this case, you can actually see that the ribs are broken.
Do you recall, or would your report refresh your recollection as to how many of the ribs were broken?
Yes, on the posterior side, the first through 7 were fractured. On the posterior, on the side, the third rib through the ninth were also fractured. And then on the anterior surface, which you can't see, the third rib was fractured.
And do you count ribs from the shoulder area down towards the hips?
Yes, you count them from the top down, and so this is like the clavicle area, which is sort of at the top of your shoulder, and then right underneath it, the first one comes around, and then they kind of curve around to the side as they go down, so we count them from the top down.
And you said basically the first, I'm clumsily grouping them up, but he had fractures on the left side from his first to his ninth rib?
Third to ninth.
Third to the ninth rib, excuse me. And
On the posterior lateral, but also on the, you're right, on the posterior, there was the first through 7.
okay. So in total, first through ninth. How many ribs are there in total?
It depends a little bit between people, but 11 approximately, 10, 11.
And were you able to tell anything about, no, strike that. This is Exhibit 56. Can you please tell the jury what they are seeing?
Yes, and so this is the posterior rib fractures. You can see where the bones are broken and pointed, and so that's where they've been fractured and then broken apart.
Are those, would they have been the bones that injured the lungs?
Yes.
And the next 57, please. This is Exhibit 57. Are you able to identify what that is?
That's the right lung, and what this shows is a relatively normal right lung.
Exhibit 50. Can you tell me what this is?
So this is his left lung, and what you can see are the areas of dark purple discoloration, and so this is where there's been bleeding and injury into the lungs. You can see a little bit here where the tissue is disrupted and, from the rib fractures, but there's been bleeding into the lungs.
multiple blunt force injuries that you indicated. I hope I use the terminology correct. What would be the mechanism of Mr. Phillips' death?
Yeah, so the mechanism or the pathophysiologic reason he could have died could be from a couple of different things. It could be from the accumulation of the blood or air within the chest cavity that can like shift the contents of the chest cavity, and that would change the blood flow to the heart and brain and cause death that way. There's also blood that's been lost, and so you have that loss of blood. That's also a physiologic factor or reason why someone can also have a death from that. So you have air that's leaking out of the lungs that can contribute to this. So there's a couple different potential mechanisms or reasons why he could have specifically died from these injuries.
Is there any significance to you about the fact that the injuries were mainly contained to one side of the body?
Jane, I'm going to object to that. Can you use that? Just so I'm overruling the objection at this point.
Is there any significance to the fact that you observed the majority of the injuries on one side of Mr. Phillips?
I mean, the significance of the distribution of injuries to one area would be important in the context of the entire investigation and understanding the context of what happened to that individual. So for example, I mean, if you're in a motor vehicle accident, it'd be unusual to just have them in a high-speed motor vehicle accident without a seatbelt. Would you have injuries just in one location? No. If someone's assaulted, typically injuries are distributed in different areas. So again, just as examples of how you correlate this versus having something that's in one particular region does make you think about how that could have occurred.
Now, you described earlier that the fractures to the rib were consistent with compression or crushing. Something like that you also testified to somebody being run over by a vehicle. Did you see any injuries on Mr. Phillips that were consistent with him being struck by a vehicle, as in standing up and being struck in that manner?
No.
Can you describe what you would expect to see in that situation?
Yes, so if you have someone that you're concerned about that's being struck by a vehicle, you look for a number of things. There's things called bumper injuries, for example, and so you will look at an individual's legs to see if they were perhaps upright when they were struck by a vehicle, and so they can be bruising on the surface of those legs and the outside of the legs. They can have fractures of the bones. And they can also have internal injuries that's damaging the planes of the tissue within the legs or lower extremities themselves. And that kind of injuries are called avulsion pockets. So we see that when people were struck by a motor vehicle. So those are things that you're looking for because they can help you correlate with the overall investigation of what occurred to an individual.
So did the absence right there. So you also documented condition of Mr. Phillips' clothing, is that correct?
Yes.
And this is Exhibit 59. Can you explain what we are looking at here?
So these are his pants, and the photo's pretty dark, but there's tear in the pants towards the middle. There you can see the frayed fibers. There's tear in his pants.
Your Honor, before we continue, could I make a request that we dim the lights?
And moving on to Exhibit 60, please. And what are we observing here?
So this is the back of his pants. You see that there's tears here in the material of the pants. Somewhat dark, but that's where the material's torn.
Now, you had mentioned earlier in your testimony that besides cause of death, you also determine the manner of death.
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury how you classify manner of death?
Yes, so there's basically 5 manners of death. There's natural accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. And based on our opinion, we'll classify them into one of those different categories, interpreting the autopsy findings with other information we have surrounding the circumstances.
In this particular case, how did you classify Mr. Phillips' death, or what did you report as the manner of death?
Undetermined.
And why did you list it as undetermined?
I listed it as undetermined because I did not have specific enough information to say exactly how these injuries occurred and the potential intent associated with them.
Can you describe what you mean by the importance of intent?
Yes, and so if someone, for example, points a gun at their head and pulls the trigger, they're intending to harm themselves, and so we would classify that as suicide. In cases where an individual is struck or run over by a motor vehicle, those can be classified in a number of different ways. One of which would be accident, which is by far the most common. When someone is accidentally struck, a pedestrian is accidentally struck or run over by another individual. But there are scenarios in which people can use a motor vehicle as a weapon and intend to run over or hurt someone or strike them with that. And so in those scenarios, when someone is intending to drive over someone, we would classify those as homicides. And so in this situation, I did not have information enough to know how to classify it best in those categories, and so hence classified it as undetermined.
So this was a question that came to me. So in my job, if a non-driver was killed in a drunk driving accident, my office, we call those homicides, the drunk driving homicides. how is that, how do you classify that as far as manner of death?
Yeah, so if someone's a passenger or is or in another vehicle struck by an impaired driver, we would still call those accidents unless we knew that that person had intentionally driven that vehicle into another vehicle.
And is this classification system one of your own, or where does this come from?
You know, it's part of the, I guess, the art of medicine and forensic pathology. And so by convention, that's how medical examiners classify those types of deaths.
In your opinion, was alcohol listed as a contributing cause on Mr. Phillips' death certificate?
No.
And,
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, to be clear, I didn't sign the actual death certificate.
Okay.
So I'd have to look, but yes.
and do you believe that his alcohol consumption contributed to his death? Or was
No.
that your opinion, I should say?
No, I don't think it did.
Now, we did discuss earlier that you were able to tell that Mr. Phillips did not immediately die from the injuries sustained. Are you able to determine an actual cause, or not cause, time of death?
Not a specific time.
Are you familiar with any interventions that would have been able to be performed in the field that may have prolonged his life?
Yes, I mean, there's a number of interventions that emergency medical services would routinely do in something like an injury like this that could potentially prolong someone's life and be part of their resuscitation.
And could you describe some of those for the jury, at least what you're aware of?
Yes, again, I'm not an emergency medicine physician, but this is pretty standard, and so they protect the airway to make sure that they can breathe. They focus on your circulation and other sorts of key elements, and so I might make sure that they have plenty of oxygen coming in. They will sometimes put tubes into the chest, which can let the air out so that it doesn't shift the chest organs around. Sometimes they can put tubes into the side of the chest that will drain the blood out, so again, it's not compressing those major organs. They'll also put intravenous catheters, so they'll put things in the blood vessels or sometimes even into bone that will put fluids into a person so that they have something that's like blood that's circulating, and ultimately can also give them blood products too. So there's a number of relatively standard things that we do.
And those interventions could have allowed Mr. Phillips to arrive at a hospital alive.
But I am going to object on sustain. Be struck.
Dr. Reichert, can you describe what the term golden hour is?
Does it sustain?
Dr. Reichert, what type of care would somebody who had hospital care, would somebody who received these type of injuries require, if you're able to answer that?
Sustain.
One moment. Your Honor, I would move for admission of Exhibit 49, and I have no further questions.
49. That's the autopsy report. Oh, yeah, okay. You have the receipts?
Good afternoon.
All right, so I just want to summarize, I guess, what some of your conclusions are here today. My understanding is that your intended testimony today was to discuss your pathological and medical findings in the autopsy of Mark Phillips. Is that correct?
My intended, I mean, I guess my intention depends on what you all are asking me to answer.
Sure. You're not offering any opinion on whether or not this was a reckless homicide, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about bulging pockets again. And could you described that briefly in your direct witness scamp, but why is it that our bulging pockets are oftentimes seen in a pedestrian who's standing upright that hasn't been struck by a vehicle?
So as the vehicle's traveling and it impacts that, it's creating basically a shearing type of injury that's tearing the tissue along a number of planes. And so as the relatively stationary part of the body, the legs typically get struck by that, it's moving that tissue and it's tearing those tissues along different planes in the lower extremities typically.
And that's something that's fairly common in it. If, for instance, I were crossing the street and were struck down by a vehicle, that's the type of injury you would oftentimes see, right?
Yes.
Not always, of course, right?
No, not always.
And then bumping injuries, those are distinct from avulsion pockets?
Bumper injuries, yes.
Yes. Could you describe to the jury what a bumper injury is for an upright pedestrian like that?
Yeah, so typically, say you're just standing there looking at the vehicle, it would strike your legs, and then you could have a contusion or a bruise there. You could have an abrasion or a scrape there. You can even have broken bones underneath, all associated from where the bumper struck the individual.
Okay. And Dr. Reichert, in this case, there were neither avulsion pockets nor bumper injuries present on Mr. Phillips. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So in this case, could Mr. Phillips' injuries have been consistent with one who came upright and then suddenly found himself in a prone or supine position in the ground through a fall or a trip of some nature? In other words, we're assuming that he was upright prior to the whatever caused these injuries, correct?
Yes, he could have been upright before these injuries occurred.
And obviously, something like tripping or falling or getting caught up on a vehicle could bring an upright pedestrian down to a prone or supine type position. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's fair.
And in this case, I want to talk first about Mr. Phillips' head injuries. So you notice both the exterior injuries to the left side of the head as well as an underlying subdural hematoma. Is that correct?
Yes.
And maybe I missed this, but you used the term hemorrhage instead of hematoma. What is the distinction between the two of them?
Hematoma is like a collection of something. So typically we'll use the term hematoma when there's a larger accumulation of blood. So that people use those terms interchangeably, to be quite honest, most of the time.
Sure. So in the sense that you were using the term hemorrhage, does that imply that this is less blood than you would subjectively typically classify as a hematoma, or were you just using the term interchangeably?
No, it's less blood. If there was a larger accumulation, I would have called it a hematoma.
Dr. Reichert, is this consistent with the type of injury that one might be able to have if they fell suddenly or fell with force from an upright position onto a hard surface like asphalt or concrete?
Yeah, it's definitely falling with force for sure.
So, for instance, if a pedestrian happened to be standing like I am here, facing a motor vehicle, running parallel, I'm going to go from my left to right, it's possible that that vehicle could throw a person off balance and cause them to get that left-sided head injury with those mechanics in play.
Let me just make sure I have that.
I'm giving you a lot in that hypothetical, doctor. So let's start with this: that if an individual were caught, as I'm standing now, facing you, by a vehicle moving from my left to right, one area in which that individual might fall would be to the left. Is that fair to say?
So moving from your left to right, yeah.
Well, yeah, moving from my right-hand side to my left-hand side, the vehicle is moving, and I get caught on that vehicle. Could that cause me to fall in a leftward manner?
Yes, I think that's possible.
And if an individual were caught or tripped by a moving vehicle, that's enough force to cause this type of injury, this subdural hemorrhaging and the exterior head injury if they strike the pavement with some force. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And you mentioned a term, Doctor, earlier. You said that well, I'm going to go back to that in a second. Would that be consistent with the type of injury you might see if, for instance, a cyclist who wasn't wearing a helmet and then took a bad spill on the pavement?
The head injury component.
Yes. All right. And in cases like this, you agree that you really can't tell exactly how the trauma occurred, just that it was blunt force trauma of some sort. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And in a case like this, motor vehicle accidents in particular, there can be a lot of different mechanisms of injuries that can cause significant injury to a person like Mr. Phillips, right?
In motor vehicle accidents in general, so I guess I need further clarification of what you mean by that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we already established we can have injury simply from coming from an upright position to a prone position and having blunt force trauma in that manner, right?
Yes.
And we can have injury from blunt force trauma of an individual knocking around, to use the professional legal and medical term, underneath the underside of the undercarriage of a vehicle. Is that fair to say?
So if someone's underneath a vehicle, their head is bouncing around, they can call those
Yep.
injuries.
It could also cause traumatic injuries elsewhere on the body if there's blunt force trauma impacting portions of the body that in the course of a pedestrian versus motor vehicle. Is that correct?
But just so I understand, so like if a person is under a vehicle when that vehicle is pushing down on a part of their body, they can cause the same sort of findings that we saw in this case.
Yep, and we'll talk about crushing in a second, but I'm talking about blunt force trauma, just the act of striking the ground or striking the truck or striking the underside with some amount of force. That can cause injuries as well.
Yes, just in general, that would cause blunt force injuries.
And in a case like this, it's difficult sometimes to rule out accident as the manner of death. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And on the left. So injuries like Mr. Phillips had, you said that are some of these injuries, Doctor, consistent with Mr. Phillips taking a sudden fall and becoming attached to the vehicle for some period of time where he would be in a position to be dragged?
Yes, that's possible.
And I'm going to show you a photograph here from the scene. This was yeah. Doctor, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 5. Do you see any visible injuries on that photograph?
Yes.
And does that appear to be an abrasion?
Yes.
All right. Offer 5 times. No objection. Be received. Doctor, I'll just try to abrasion like this, Doctor, consistent with somebody who may have been dragged for a period of time attached to the side of a vehicle?
Yeah, that's a potential mechanism that injury could have occurred.
photographs of Mr. Phillips's pants. Do you recall whether or not you received his belt with Mr. Phillips's body for examination?
I don't remember offhand.
Okay. Showing you some marks.
Yes. Yes.
That belt appeared to be out of place, pulled out, or damaged in some capacity.
Yes.
And could that be consistent with an item that may have been caught or forced Mr. Phillips into a position where he would come into contact with either the bottom of the vehicle or some other mechanism causing trauma?
Yes, I mean that and the tears of the jeans would all be part of being pulled underneath the vehicle.
And that can happen, right? If somebody falls close enough to a vehicle, they can be pulled under to a certain degree and become injured either by the underside or the side of the vehicle. Is that correct?
So if someone falls underneath it?
Somebody falls in close proximity to a vehicle, a pedestrian can take a tumble or fall in a position where they're going to come into contact with the vehicle, right?
Yeah, and I guess if someone fell and slipped under the vehicle.
Okay. And that's not something that we can rule out in this case, right? That Mr. Phillips slipped in some capacity in close proximity to a truck that was speeding away from him.
I don't know that. So.
All right. So, Doctor, you used a term with Ms. Kemp earlier. Talking about crushing, you said it's consistent with but not specific for. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is the difference between consistency and specific for, Doctor?
I mean, it's consistent because, based on my training and experience, those types of injuries in an isolated area, but then on the back of the ribs, the side, and towards the front would all fit with that being a compression type of injury. And so it would be consistent with that. But taking in isolation, I can't say 100% I know for a fact that this is due to that crushing, but I can say that based on my training and experience, that would be consistent with it.
So, yeah, so just to use a hypothetical here, I mean, it would be specific to a gunshot wound if you recovered a bullet slug from somebody's torso, right?
Yes.
However, it might be consistent with that if you noticed an entry-exit wound, but couldn't quite determine whether or not it was a firearm or something else.
Potentially. Hopefully we'd be able to tell that was indicative of a gunshot wound.
Following up on Ms. Kemp's questions about alcohol, is it fair to assume that you wouldn't typically consider alcohol as a contributing cause of death unless this was a circumstance where a person overdosed or drank to the point where the respiratory function shut down, or in other words, the alcohol was the primary factor that led to a person's death?
Right. It would need to be either the cause of death or a contributing condition in some particular manner. Could be, most typically it is when it's combined with other drugs.
So if somebody was just drunk and behaving recklessly, you wouldn't typically call alcohol a contributing cause of death under those circumstances?
That's correct.
All right. And the 149 ethanol level, is that consistent with the legal version of a 0.149 blood alcohol concentration?
Yes.
And Mr. Phillips was also positive for diphenhydramine or Benadryl, is that correct?
Yes.
And Benadryl can impact or contribute to the intoxicating effects of alcohol, is that fair?
Yes, they can have a synergistic effect or combined effect.
Now, the information that you received from the investigators in this case, Doctor, Were you relying primarily on Mr. Knudsen, the medical examiner, or did you have contact with law enforcement as well?
I also have law enforcement's reports as well.
Okay. And when you say reports, you actually received police reports?
Yes.
At any point during your autopsy or your medical investigation, were you informed that Ms. Phillips had claimed to be domestically abused by Mr. Phillips shortly before his death?
I recall that there was some sort of altercation, but I don't recall the specifics.
All right. And Doctor, I'm going to ask you another question here in response to Ms. Skemp. The availability of emergency medical measures like a chest tube or an intraosseous IV or some of the other measures you were discussing, do you agree that that's no guarantee that those measures would have saved a person's life?
Yes, it's no guarantee.
And it's impossible to tell how quickly Mr. Phillips died in this case, is that correct?
Not specifically, no.
Quite possibly could have been very quick.
Yeah, it could have been minutes.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Rita?
Following up on those last questions, those life-saving measures could have extended the minutes that Mr. Phillips had to survive and allow him to get to a hospital. Is that accurate?
Yes, they potentially could have.
So what is the golden hour?
Judge, objection.
Your Honor,
Thing, this is still not relevant.
he opened the door when he...
No, he didn't do it. No.
And it is, there's body being displayed. This is Defense Exhibit 510. I believe Mr. Zacher asked you about those injuries that you see on Mr. Phillips' torso. He asked you if they were consistent with being dragged. Can you tell by looking at this which side of the body these injuries are on?
I believe they're on the left side. Yes.
Could they also be consistent with sharp objects having been dragged or pulled across the skin?
It's something that's scraping the skin. Right? So it's an abrasion, so it's a scrape. And so there's lots of possibilities of how you can get a scrape.
And strike that. Mr. Zacher had asked you about tripping over a vehicle or some part of the vehicle. Did you see any injuries on Mr. Phillips' legs that were consistent with that kind of tripping injury?
I mean, he had some abrasions and some bruises on his legs, but I don't know if he tripped. I don't know if a specific tripping type of injuries. So.
Dr. Reichert, I am showing you what's been previously admitted as State's Exhibit number 31. In the course of your investigations of other deaths, did Mr. Phillips have an injury on his body that was consistent with being struck by a side view mirror?
Objection beyond the scope of cross.
System.
It's, Your Honor, it's not beyond the scope of cross. Do you want us to?
That's your question.
Okay. Are there any injuries? So Mr. Zacher asked, I'll ask it a different way. Mr. Zacher had asked you about I think it was the bruise of his left temporalis and the subdural hemorrhaging that could have been caused by a vehicle moving from his right, pushing him onto his left side. Am I summarizing that line of questioning correctly?
Yeah. That's my recollection.
Is it also possible or consistent with the injuries you saw on Mr. Phillips that if he was facing this pickup truck, but maybe standing to the side, that a side view mirror would cause that bruise to his left temporalis muscle?
Objection beyond the scope of cross.
Overruled, Your Honor.
I mean, if the side view mirror or what have you impacted the side of that head, of his head, with some force, it could cause that contusion or bruising of the scalp and push him to the ground.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Recross?
Briefly, Doctor, are you aware of how far off the side of the mirrors were on the
No.
And if a side view mirror struck somebody with enough force to give them subdural hemorrhaging, might want to expect to see some form of damage to the side view mirror in the process.
I don't know.
And if a side view mirror struck an individual on the left side, as the state implied in this case, would you not also, in some cases, see a corresponding injury to the side that the individual fell onto?
You could have multiple impact sites. I mean, in that scenario.
Nothing further.
Any